Dear Monsieur,
Dear Mr. Jenkins, ladies and gentlemen, heads of states and delegations, dear friends, to start with, I'd like to say that I'm sorry that I couldn't listen to what Mrs. van der Leyen had to say for reasons that were out of my control. And I want to say how glad I was to meet my counterpart, the minister from Singapore, once more. Well, first of all, by way of introduction, let me say that I think that we just entered a new phase for international affairs, and one which consequently has led to changes in our approaches to security with huge implications for defense, for the armies, for intelligence services. And you might say that indeed extremism is undoubtedly one of the major phenomena of our time. This enemy has designated us as its enemies, and we have no other option but to answer back in a way that is tough, but also that is smart and that is conscious of our values. This enemy, in reality, is our common enemy because what terrorist groups typically do is destabilize states. The state I am representing today, the states that you are representing today, the threat we are up against is unprecedented in its character and in its intensity, and certainly truly opens a new era in terms of our approaches to defense and security. Sadly, like many nations represented here, France is tragically aware of the consequences of terrorism for its security and the lives of its citizens. In 2015 and 16 on French soil, we have been attacked by jihadis who are waging an open war, fanatical in its tenets, barbarous and dastardly in its means. A war that targets primarily civilians. And the foe we're up against is not one we just found out about today. Its hostility to us goes back a long time. It's been trying to strike us for decades, and recently it has organized in the Levant in the form of a proto-state able to raise an army, to raise funds, and to spread its barbaric influence by subjugating whole populations. Faced with this threat, we have developed a collective, unified response. Our strength is twofold, that we're part of a coalition and that we're complying with international law. Indeed, in 2014, France heeded the call from Iraq by engaging its forces alongside a coalition of over 60 countries. Right now, we have about 4,000 French troops that are participating in anti-ISIS engagements, supporting a number of different forces, Kurdish forces, for instance. Yesterday, I was on the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier with President Hollande, with other capacities, including a German frigate. And so, of course, there is an element of coercion in our response, but that should not lead us to forget our values, including what I just mentioned, respect for international law, because no matter how dangerous the threat, we must keep complying with international law, particularly if we want local populations to respect what we do. As I said, terrorists want to bring down governments, and so part of our effort should be to support government, something that we're doing in Africa, but not only in Africa. Indeed, we must remind ourselves that for their growth and for any attempts they make at proliferating, terror groups primarily rely on the weaknesses of states. So fighting terrorism must be supported by well-structured states whose institutions enjoy strong popular acceptance and whose defense forces are properly trained. That is the whole point of our military cooperation, from education to training to equipment to engagement. And in fact, it is also the meaning behind the European effort, which we started with Ursula von der Leyen some time ago, something which I hope will be taken up and validated in a few days from now. We need to show unfailing support to the idea of consolidating armed forces that face major security challenges. I also wanted to highlight my and the French government's belief that we cannot abandon our regional partners who are on the front line of this fight. And indeed, let me take this opportunity to pay tribute to the central Iraqi power and Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, who is dealing with two antagonistic religious extremisms. And their diplomatic efforts, just like the inter-Iraqi dialogue, have shown how aware they are of what has to be done for the future. And I've talked about cooperation, but let us not forget that terrorist organizations also feed off poverty, they feed off underdevelopment, and sometimes a general lack of prospects within rapidly growing populations. So tackling those root causes, by tackling those root causes, we stand a better chance of uprooting terrorism. The threat is very comprehensive, very wide, and so our response, too, should be very comprehensive and able to combine the military dimension and the political, economic, and social dimensions. And this is only possible if we truly understand the enemy we're up against. This enemy is a military enemy, as I've just said, but its strength also is derived from its system of dogmatic beliefs. ISIS, as I've said so many times, is also a totalitarian ideology that replicates some of the typical traits of 20th century totalitarian regimes: personality cult, mobilization of all resources towards belligerent ends, a police state based on extreme and arbitrary violence, and then most importantly maybe the ranking of human beings along ethnic or sectarian lines. These murderous ideologies have had an attraction on some parts of our population, which we need to try and understand. Let me insist on this ideological dimension because it is the most intractable one, but it is also the one that we need to work at reducing the most. An arm, a weapon, can neutralize terrorists, damage their infrastructure, but it's much more complex to destroy an idea, however mendacious or criminal, especially when terrorists use such effective media as the internet and social media. This is another dimension in which we need to wage that war. At the Forum of Dakar, the Dakar Forum, which in a way is the Manama Dialogue for Africa, I was struck when I realized how heads of states there and heads of government were very preoccupied with the ideological influence of cult-like sectarian movements that can then help recruit individuals or encourage them to commit violence. We have heard from Islamic clerics from across Africa, and we talked about the importance of giving a doctrinal response to this ideological threat of Islamism. And it's remarkable that in a forum that was dedicated to security, we very soon decided that it was opportune to talk about religion and doctrine. So it is a very important challenge I think that today the fight against terrorism, both within our borders and outside of them, is characterized by ever tighter relations between domestic security and international defense considerations, and as such, it requires our response to include criminal measures when faced with some of our own radicalized citizens or citizens that have already crossed the line to terrorism. Certainly, every state, every government has to find its own path, its own means to do that. But the more our societies are resilient intellectually and morally in the face of this ideology of death, and the better equipped will be to fight it. This aspect of extremism is a real challenge which we need to tackle. There are specific responses in terms of religious training, communication, on the social media. What this means, I repeat, is that victory cannot be purely military. I see there are a lot of initiatives, including the Sawab Center in the Emirates, which does important work. Now, all of these initiatives are precious, and they're also precious for our own national initiatives. In France, for instance, we have taken a number of steps to reduce the influence of radical ideology with public outreach campaigns, with the Stop Jihadism initiative is starting to bear fruit in terms of de-radicalization. Now, in the book written by King Abdullah of Jordan, The Last Chance, I had noted a very interesting formula. I said the ability of some extremists to influence our perceptions by committing barbarous acts forces moderates from all religions to speak out. And if the majority remains silent, then the extremists will dominate the debate. This is not a success yet. We're only at the beginning of this fight against those extremists who want to divide our continents and divide our societies. It is a general mobilization against extremism that we need to pursue together. Humanism alone can defeat this anti-humanism, and that's the main reason for our collective message today. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you.